"I suppose your old servant Betty Parker is still in the house, Miss Martha," said he. The poor girl bowed an affirmative, but had no power to speak. "Well, then," said the doctor, "I should recommend that you should put her to sit here, for it is no good for any of us to stay any longer, for it's all over just as much as if he were already in his coffin. You had better go away and see what you can pack up to get off with, Miss Martha. That's all that's left to be done with. As far as I can see, come, Miss Gabberly," he added, "I have a friendly word or two to say to you. So your boy shall mount my pony, and I'll drive your donkey for you." And so saying, he took the little woman under his arm and trudged off, without waiting for her to inform him whether she approved his proposal or not. Mr. Parsons, giving one scowling look at the silent bed, followed them, and Martha and Michael were left together beside the dying man. Upon perceiving the totally unconscious state into which Sir Matthew had fallen, Michael had gently withdrawn himself from behind his pillows, and now stood, almost as silent and motionless as himself, beside the bed, respectfully waiting to receive from the desolate and weeping Martha some hint or instruction respecting his staying where he was, or of leaving her. Never, when the poor dependent of her family, had the young heart of Michael been impressed with a feeling of respect so profound as he at that moment felt for the unhappy girl. In truth, the feeling was so powerful as to interfere with his usefulness, for he shrank from appearing to put himself forward too presumptuously by giving her advice, or venturing in any degree to dictate what it might be best for her to do. But when, after remaining thus bashfully silent for a quarter of an hour, he perceived that she gave no other sign of life than by tears that flowed incessantly and sighs that seemed to heave her breast almost to bursting. When he saw this, he began to think that some degree of seeming presumption on his part might be better and more profitable for her, whom he could really have died to serve, than the continuance of the degree of deference which must render him useless. Approaching, therefore, to the chair on which she had thrown herself, he ventured to say, "Miss Martha, where can I find your old servant, Betty Parker? I remember her very well. She used to be always in the nursery. If you would tell me where she is likely to be, I will go for her." Poor Martha for a moment ceased to weep, and looking up at him, "Michael Armstrong," she replied, "I am not conscious of ever having injured any human being but yourself, and yet you are the only one who is near to support and help me in this dreadful hour. God bless you for your kindness, my good boy. Do not go away, Michael. That is, I mean, do not leave the house till it is all over. Indeed, I think you may be useful to me." "Miss Martha," he returned, "you will trust me to sit here, while you yourself summon whomever you may wish to keep you company. I will keep out of sight in case—" and here he stopped. "His eyes will never open more, Michael," she replied, while the tears again burst forth, "and thank God their last look at me was gentle. But I almost fear to leave the room, Michael. I would not that he should breathe his last, and I not by him." But Michael, unskilful as he was, felt that the scene was too awful a one for a poor girl to be left alone in, and he therefore persisted to declare with the authority which such subduing sorrow gives to all around who take the trouble to exercise it, that he would watch by the bedside of her father while she sought the old woman mentioned by Dr. Crockley. Reluctantly and unresistingly she consented, and giving a look at the bed that seemed to wring her very heart, she quitted the room, leaving Michael Armstrong alone with the motionless mass of still living clay before which he had so often trembled. How strangely eventful had been the interval between those well-remembered days and the one actual present with him! How extraordinary the change in the circumstances of both parties! It was not a triumph, but it was that with thankfulness which Michael felt, as the sense of this came fully upon him during these moments of profound stillness, and the result of all the moving thoughts that crowded upon his mind was an earnest prayer to heaven that he might never be placed in any circumstances likely to harden his heart and make him the cause of suffering to others, a fearful and dreadful crime, which he felt as he gazed with trembling awe on the sunken features of the living corpse before him. He must, in the sight of God, be held as one of the most daring rebellion to his heavenly will of which man is capable. Solemn and solitary as was Michel's position in the chamber of Sir Matthew, the interval of Martha's absence did not seem long. She returned, accompanied by the old servant who had been nursery attendant, though never raised to the dignity of nurse, from the birth of the eldest child of the family, and who was the only one remaining of all the numerous household who retained the slightest feeling of attachment to any of them. To her, habit stood in the place of preference, and she might, perhaps, be said to love all the Dowling children, from the eldest to the youngest, a sentiment which led her to conceive, as in duty bound, a most hearty detestation of their stepmother. It was, therefore, with something very like pleasure that she obeyed a summons so solemn and so peremptory as to justify her, even in the judgment of Mrs. Saunderson, for laying aside the ironing box which she had been plying incessantly for 2 whole days upon the frills and furbelows of Lady Clarissa, in order to obey it. On perceiving the condition in which her master lay, Betty Parker strongly advised poor Martha to retire, urging the uselessness of her remaining to look upon what was so grievous, when a baby might see at half a glance that the poor gentleman could not tell friend from foe. But Betty Parker knew little of the intensity of Martha's pertinacious love for her unworthy parent, if she fancied that her very reasonable remonstrance would produce any effect. Martha attempted not even to answer it, but placing herself in a chair close beside the bed, remained nearly as motionless as the faintly breathing figure that lay upon it. Poor Mchl knew not too well what he ought to do next. He felt that he was useless there. He knew that he should be stared at as a very incomprehensible intruder if he descended to the offices, yet he remembered that his benefactress had bid him not to go, and he could not have felt himself more strongly bound to remain had the crime of high treason been involved in his departure. Yet there was something in the stupid, puzzled look with which Betty Parker regarded him that vexed his spirit. He was conscious that he had no business in that room, and therefore at such a moment he ought not to be there. After a few moments of reflection, he approached Martha, and making so profound a reverence as to convince Betty that let him be who he would, he was a very well-behaved young gentleman, he said, "I will now, Miss Martha, go to the inn for an hour or 2, and then return to take your orders." A look of gratitude was all her reply, and Mchl departed. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon when he entered the little inn, where the postboy, who had driven him from Fairley in the morning, was still waiting his orders. "I cannot tell you yet, my lad, when I shall be ready to return," he replied, in answer to the boy's questioning. "It's all one to me, master," said the driver. "In course I shall be paid accordingly." "Certainly you will," returned Mchl, and he was then left to eat his solitary dinner with what appetite he might. For 3 long melancholy hours he employed himself in pacing backwards and forwards on the high road before the little inn, and was beginning to think that time enough had elapsed to justify his returning to inquire how matters were going on at Dowling Lodge, when the sound of a carriage approaching, as it seemed from the park's gates, caused him to stop abruptly to listen and to look. The equipage that drew near was a handsome travelling carriage, though its appearance was considerably disfigured by the prodigious quantity of luggage, which was fastened by ropes and chains to every part of it. The Imperial only formed the fountain for a pyramid of trunks and bandboxes, which were piled upon it. The servant's seat behind was loaded to its very utmost capacity with more trunks and bandboxes, while, chained below it, was a massive coffer that looked very like a plate chest, having suspended round its sides bundles, baskets, and bags innumerable. Nor was the interior by any means reserved for live lumber alone, for although the rigid figures of Lady Clarissa Dowling and her waiting woman Saunderson were visible in the midst, it appeared to be crammed with every imaginable species of property which such a conveyance could transport. Mchl watched the overloaded vehicle roll by with great satisfaction. Whatever happens, he thought, Miss Martha must be better without her. Relieved by knowing that he should not again run the risk of encountering her delectable ladyship, Mchl immediately took his way to the magnificent mansion she had forsaken, and perceiving that the hall doors stood wide open, preferred passing through them to encountering again the motley throng that had taken possession of the offices. But instead of finding this portion of the house as quiet and forsaken as he had left it, he was startled by hearing, as he mounted the steps of the stately portico, a multitude of voices in violent altercation. At first he felt disposed to turn away and seek another entrance, but the vehemence of the sounds he heard excited his curiosity, and he went on. Instead of one, half a dozen strangers might have entered without running any risk of having their right there challenged, so great was the confusion that reigned, and Mchl might have passed up the great stairs and into the chamber which it was his purpose to visit without any difficulty. But he was prevented from taking immediate advantage of this by hearing the words which excited new fears for the unfortunate Martha, and ere he had listened many minutes, he became aware that a new creditor had reached the lodge after he had left it, who had come, armed with proper authority, to arrest the knight, dead or alive. Nor did the discussion of this event cause any of the uproar, for the agents of the parties who had previously sent in the execution were threatening with all sorts of punishment several of the servants, whom they accused of having been bribed to assist Lady Clarissa in the removal of many valuables which she had no right to take. It was not this part of the tumult, however, that interested him, and, having obtained but too clearly the information that Sir Matthew was arrested, he once more sought for the unhappy Martha in the dismal chamber where he had left her. And there he found her, but with such frightful adjuncts to her natural grief, that the state of quiet decent sorrow in which he had left her seemed a condition positively enviable compared to that in which he found her now. Sir Matthew had breathed his last, and the corpse was already arranged with decency upon its stately bed, but on each side of it stood an officer, whose duty it was to violate by their presence the solemn sanctity of that dismal chamber, and to prevent the bodies being carried to the grave, till the claims of their employer were satisfied. In front of her father's corpse, with her troubled eyes, no longer bathed in the healing dew of natural sorrow, turning from it to its rude guardians, and back again to all that was left of the sinful being she had so fondly blindly loved, stood the wretched daughter, so sad a spectacle of woe that it was evident that the men themselves had turned their hard eyes studiously away, because they felt a pang of pity as they looked upon her. "Come with me, Miss Martha," cried Mchl, unceremoniously seizing her arm. "You must not, you cannot remain here. You can do no good, Miss Martha. All is over now. You must come away, you must indeed." The only answer that poor Martha gave was forcibly shaking off the hand that held her, and then pointing first to her father's body and afterwards to the two unseemly attendants who stood beside it. "It is no use, young man, to strive with her," said Betty, who was still occupied in completing some of her lugubrious operations about the bed. "I know her better than you do. She will stay here, watching him till she is as dead as he is, rather than go away and leave his body to be tended by such as those." For a moment Mchl really felt all the enervating effects of despair, and stood perfectly incapable of even imagining any means of help for the agony which it wrung his heart to witness. But as the old woman pursued her ghastly occupation, she went muttering on, expatiating on the sinful and unchristian outrage that was thus committed. "And what will the rogues get by it?" she said. "Does he mean to show the corpse for a farthing a head at his factory blackguards? Isn't he as big a fool as he is a knave?" No, mistress, by no means," said the friendly defender of Mr. Joseph Parsons, for it was at his suit that the body of Sir Matthew had been arrested. "You may call the superintendent rogue, or knave, or what you will of that kind. I don't suppose that there's many who would contradict you, but as to his being a fool, especially as to the doing of what he's done here, that he is not. 'Twas his only chance." "And how much do you think he'll make of it?" demanded old Betty with a sneer. "Why, just the £467 as is due to him," replied the man. To all this poor Martha appeared not to pay the slightest attention, and, in truth, neither understood nor heard a word of it, but Mchl did, and with sudden animation stepped up to the man who had spoken, and whispered in his ear, Perhaps we may be able to settle this business without any further difficulty. Step out of the room with me, will you? For a moment. Your companion can do all that is necessary without you." "Neither I nor my employer are people to make difficulties," replied the man, "and I am quite ready to hear you, young master, if you have anything to say upon the subject." They accordingly retired together, and in a wondrously short space of time the uninitiated Mchl was made to understand all the circumstances of the case, the most important of which was that if, as Mr. Parsons hoped and expected, Miss Martha could find ready money enough quietly to pay his little private account with the late Sir Matthew, the arrest would immediately be withdrawn, and the body left for her to dispose of at her pleasure. "And the sum," said Mchl, "is how much?" £467, replied the man, "with some little matter not exceeding £4 or £5 more for costs." "Withdraw the arrest," said Mchl, "and the money shall be instantly forthcoming." "Let us see the money forthcoming," replied the fellow, grinning, "and the arrest shall be instantly withdrawn." "Here is the money, sir," said Mchl, taking out the pocketbook containing Martha's generous donation, and drawing from it notes to the amount demanded. "Then the business will be soon settled, young gentleman. May I take the liberty to ask your name?" "My name is of no consequence whatsoever, sir," replied Mchl, "but lose no time in giving me the discharge. Only first enter that chamber with me once again, withdraw your companion from his frightful watch, and tell the poor young lady that it is over." The man readily obeyed, and the mourning but thankful Martha was once more left with her own old servant to watch beside her father's corpse.